This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Matt Connell back in the studio.
Good morning, lads.
Thrive Perspectives. Man, these come around fast, actually, I find anyway. But and the topic we're going to continue today is the one we started with our last episode. This is kind of Demons and the Demonic Part 2, or as we're nicknaming it, the Spook Sessions. No, we won't say that. But welcome, listeners. Great to have you with us. And really, this is a serious topic. And we've been reading in our sister podcast, Thrive Deeper, through the book of Matthew and somewhat Mark as well. And through that, it's been really apparent how much Jesus dealt with the demonic, demons, unclean spirits. It was a very big part of his ministry through the parts of Matthew that we're reading at the moment. And so that kind of prompted us to say, well, maybe we need to have a conversation in our Perspectives podcast about this, because there are people, I think, on the gambit that range from there's no such thing as demons and it's all a bit, Ouija board, hoodoo guru stuff, to the other end where people blame everything. And we thought, maybe there's a really good opportunity here to have this conversation. So if you haven't listened to part 1, really encourage you to have a look at that. That sort of lays out the biblical basis of the demonic and Satan and evil spirits and those sorts of things. And we're moving into part 2, and today we're going to talk a bit more specifically about the spectrum of how the demonic can engage with us in this world, in our lives.
Well, it doesn't help that this has been fictionalized by Hollywood. Hollywood loves to grab, and this is where the unhelpful sort of spook thing gets associated with this. And so we really need to try and put that out of our minds. There's something about whenever Hollywood covers something, it just then seems fictional. Even very true things, you just think, oh, that's just a story. Like as soon as Hollywood does it, it just doesn't seem real anymore. We do have to try and put that out of our minds, as well as the sort of cartoon renditions of demons with horns and pitchforks and all of that sort of stuff. So what we're dealing with here is a spiritual world. We're operating within an open worldview that recognizes there isn't just the physical world. It's interesting, the reaction of incredulity of, all of that's just silly, superstitious stuff, is a very, very uniquely Western, I'm going to call post-Enlightenment, in inverted commas, response that came from, I guess, a particular historical circumstance in which we, in European influenced culture, sort of closed reality down to a closed system, completely unjustifiably. It's not because we're more sophisticated or educated than other people, because there is no justification for closing. I mean, science has yielded, science has yielded wonderful things, but I think we became so enamored with our science that we narrowed reality down to what science could potentially deal with. And as I said, completely unjustifiable. And so there's a degree of arrogance in just dismissing this belief in a spiritual world that is and has been acknowledged by every other culture everywhere all the time, right? Yeah. So that reaction of incredulity is specific to our culture, and there's a degree of arrogance in that dismissal, because for a lot of people it's a matter of very immediate intuition that this is a reality of life. Most people in the world will say, well, of course that. I mean, I've just been in Africa, for example, and for, Africans, this is such a real part of life. Now, who are we to go and say, oh, silly, superstitious, uneducated?
Well, we're contradicting the Bible, because Paul in Ephesians,
I mean, I'm referring. I'm trying to challenge people even who probably don't yet believe in the Bible, and because I think as Christians, though, we need to acknowledge that that's part of the background that we're in as a culture, and I do think we need to challenge that.
But it's interesting, because when you actually talk to people, it is the minority that still have that completely closed down worldview.
Because it is very counterintuitive, actually.
But most people have some intuition that there is something else, where they have a spiritual, they're not Christian, but they've got either some other religious idea. They could be in the New Age. If people, for example, visit a medium, they're admitting right there that there's something to be tapped into if you pay attention to horoscopes with some curiosity and actually sort of believe that it has something to say in your life at any level, means that you are kind of entertaining the idea that there is something beyond just the material.
But I think in the
world.
Western world, I agree, but I think in the Western world, we think of that spiritual dimension. And I think you're right. Everyone kind of now is, oh yeah, I'm sure there's some kind of spiritual, but it's all on the good side. I don't know if any other listeners saw this, but there was a news item on one of our kind of news documentary programs. And even the announcer, who normally is meant to present a headline before it cuts to the article in a very kind of committal way to either way, was almost laughing on her face when they were talking about the fact that this church was casting out demons, you know.
Yeah.
So I get that, and I think there are lots of people, but they're only thinking on one side of the fence.
But I think this is the point, and it even filters through to us as Christians as well, because part of the strategy of what Satan is trying to do is to make us laugh at the idea that he even exists. He's sort of happy with that as a strategy. And so what I'm saying is, like, on one hand, even though we have closed down our sense of, you know, everything's just materialistic, I still think that's a minority of people. I think majority of people are open to the idea that there's something else, but they would laugh in your face at the suggestion that there's actually a devil or a demonic spirits out there, and they would, and they just think it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
But yet, somewhere inside, they also are open to the idea that there is a spiritual realm. And I think even as Christians, we do the same thing to an extent. You know, we can look at these things and kind of like, that's, you know, that's just too weird, it's too way out, you know. But at least we know we've got some sort of framework to understand it. I don't know why we would dismiss it, these things so readily, because to me it's almost like if there is a spiritual realm and spiritual beings, well then of course there's going to be spiritual beings that are working against us.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the Gospels where you started, Stu, and build on where we were last week, because the fact is that very central to the teaching of Jesus was this theme that runs through his ministry, that the real enemy is not flesh and blood. I mean, as Paul expresses in Ephesians chapter 6, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers.
And right before that, he says, put on the full armor of God so that you'll stand against the schemes of the devil, for we are not. So it's like
So what is it? What is the specific way that he puts that then?
He puts it, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens.
And so that's the importance of that. Is that summarize essentially what Jesus was saying to his own people? Your real enemy is not the Romans. It's not Roman oppression, actually. It's spiritual oppression. That's the problem here. And I mean, we see this in, you know, when Jesus is baptized, and in, you know, the pattern in the Old Testament is, you know, the Spirit of God would come upon a leader and they would go out and fight a battle. You know, it's David being anointed, then fighting Goliath. It's the Spirit of God coming upon Ehud, and then he goes and defeats the Moabite king, and, you know, in the book of Judges. So there's that pattern. You see that in, you know, Jesus is baptized, the Spirit of God descends upon him, and then he goes out and fights, well, the real enemy. I mean, he goes out and confronts the devil, Satan. This is actually a big theme in the Gospels, and Mark, interestingly, in his Gospel, he particularly, because he condenses things down, and there's a particular focus on this, and he actually expands on some on many instances of demon possession. And so the driving out of Satan is important, because what he depicts Jesus as doing is bringing the authority of God to bear over people's lives. And whenever people come under the authority of God, there is this authority then over, you know, as Psalm 91 says, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. And it goes on to say, you will tread upon the lion, the cobra, you will trample the serpent, right? And so we see that happening in the Gospels, that whoever comes under the shelter of the authority of God in Christ, there's this trampling of the evil one in those instances. An interesting book, and actually, Connell, you put me onto this book, you know, mainstream publisher by a leading psychiatrist, Richard Gallagher. It's interesting that he came to this, and I mentioned this in the last episode, he came to this somewhat of a skeptic, because he was asked by Catholic priests who were involved in what in Catholicism they refer to as exorcism. We would probably use language like deliverance ministry or something like that. they recognized they needed to ensure that this wasn't just psychiatric things going on here, that there was demon possession. So they asked him to track with them whenever they confronted these cases to ensure that they were seeing this rightly. Anyway, so he comes in as somewhat of a skeptic, and he recognizes that a lot of cases were psychiatric conditions. It was mental illness. And he's very cautious about that. I mean, he even says, he says that probably even most cases that we think might be demonic possession are mental illness. Now, I would suggest there can be a bit of an entanglement there as well, because these demonic forces, they take advantage of whatever weakness we've got. But that aside, he talks about all of these instances that were absolutely undeniably demonic oppression or possession, and we'll talk about that, the spectrum in a moment. It's the girl that, because they do a lot of Catholic exorcists, they do the exorcism right in Latin because they don't want the person to understand, but they believe that the demon can understand. And it's the instance of the girl that replies to the Latin rite in fluent Latin, like speaking fluent Latin. It's the supernatural strength that someone suddenly has. He even talks at one case about, someone actually, and I don't want to freak people. No, by the way, this is, in no wise do we want to freak people out in this episode. We're going to emphasize in this episode, there's nothing to be afraid of here if you're under the shelter of the Most High, right, in Christ.
I think that's really important.
So we'll keep admitting that. But, he talks about one case where someone like levitates with like 8 witnesses present.
And these can be, because I've read a number of stories like that too. And some of these stories, it's easy to kind of go, oh, that's ridiculous. But then I was reading some work from a journalist who actually investigated a lot of this. And there was multiple accounts of all these sorts of things happening, but when they happen, they tend to not get reported, and things get discovered later on, where things got written down but never really got released to the public because a fear of being ridiculed and so on. Yeah. And so there was a kind of an integrity behind it, and there was people like nurses, doctors involved in it, and everybody who saw it didn't want to talk about it afterwards. It's a sort of, and these are not, so there's not people who've could have got a horse in the race to try to promote this stuff. They're going, oh, let's not talk about this. And so again, you could probably say there's stuff going on to try to, make something up here, but it does seem to be an occurrence, and you can't just dismiss it completely.
So we'll talk a bit about today, a little bit more practically about the spectrum, and we'll also try and cover what we would describe as deliverance, some kind of process of deliverance. But I think it's important to say up front that we need to be careful of both under-ascribing and over-ascribing things to demonic forces. Now, we built a bit of a foundation for this in the last episode. I mean, we often talk about Satan doing this and Satan doing that. Now, Satan is not omnipresent, right? He's not everywhere at once. So there's some mysterious complex web of demonic forces, malevolent spiritual beings.
So let me just come back a step, because you said at the start of that sentence, we've got to be careful not to ascribe,
over-ascribe or under-ascribe.
And I think, absolutely, of course, I agree with that. I think we do need to accept, though, that the fact the world is broken was because of the original deception.
Yeah, that's right.
And so there's lots of stuff that's broken that doesn't require the injection of a demonic spirit or a demon or anything else. The world is broken.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, the danger in under-ascribing, I think is, recognizing, like, we do need to recognize this is a facet of reality. Like, this is going on, right? And, as you say, these demonic forces, they want to hide. And I described them in the last episode as, kind of like spiritual parasites. They leech off us. They exist because they attach themselves to us. They leech off our authority, actually. They exist in this realm because we were given this realm to rule. And so, in a sense, they can exist here because we give them permission, and only as long as we give them permission. So there's a sense of tricking us into giving them permission. So in a sense, like a parasite, I've had, leeches on my leg, and a leech will anesthetize the wound so it can just keep sucking my blood without me knowing that they're there.
Just before you move on from that, I don't want to make sure you know where you are, but I think a good point that you made last week that I think will help people understand some of this as well is angels were created to serve humans.
Yes.
Demons are essentially beings like angels.
Yeah.
If you take the account that the demons are potentially fallen angels who decided to rebel against God, then their job is to serve mankind, but to serve it from their agenda, not from God's agenda.
Yeah. If they're going to exploit us, let's put it that way, we also have to give permission. We have to give them permission. But we get tricked, and we'll talk about how, because deception is the great tool.
Yes.
It's, we need to be careful, and we need to be vigilant. And this is in the New Testament, there's a call to vigilance, Peter says, because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. And the devil is a way of referring to this malevolent spiritual world.
You'll trample on the lion.
Yeah, exactly. That's, Psalm 91, you'll trample upon the lion and the serpent. So that's a matter for vigilance, not fear, right? Just vigilance, okay? Remembering, and this is the importance that recognizing that temptation and stepping out from under the covering of God, straying from God. The problem with it is, first and foremost, because we're rebelling against God, but also then we become vulnerable, right? Because we come out from under the cover in a sense.
This is good in terms of reframing how aware we are of the spiritual realm, because I think as Christians, we have a relationship with God, and everything's sort of framed in that context as if, if we do come out of the authority of God, our relationship with God suffers. And go, that's a problem, obviously. But when the Bible talks about, especially in the New Testament, in Matthew, talks about the demonic world and the powers and principalities and so on, it's reframing it to realize we are actually in the midst of, that is the actual reality that we operate in. And so, of course, when we come out of God's authority, it affects our relationship with God. But there's another side to that, because we are immersed in this reality that we can't really see or perceive. So it's like we're in it, but we're desensitized to it. So it's easy to think just in terms of that one dimension with a relationship with God, that everything that's really going on is set inside this context of a spiritual influence and battle. And we are very desensitized. We're sensitized to our relationship with God, but we're desensitized to everything else. And then maybe we just don't take it seriously enough, that when we do look at things, we always look at it in terms of the natural world or what we see with our eyes. But I guess we've got to open our eyes and see that there's a bigger, much, much bigger thing being played out here. And goes back to some of the other things we talked about, like politics and, how we react and different opinions and how we get on with each other and how we treat each other. It's more than just that. It's more than just treating people well, because everything that we do is set inside that huge spiritual context that we can't see. And it's got to do with our relationship with God, but it's also got to do with the fact that we're actually in the middle of a battle that we're fighting that we can't see. And this is probably why this is important, because
so let's use an example in a unfortunately ordinary circumstances. So the person that clicks on a pornographic image, let's just recognize, okay, so first of all, it's doing something that grieves God. That's the primary thing. It also treats another human being as an object, as a means to an end, which is also very problematic, which then affects your own sense of yourself, and that breaks down that. So that there's a desecration of something sacred. Okay, so that causes a sense of shame. So this is all the layers, right? Now, shame is problematic because it shrouds you in darkness. But the thing in the light of what we're talking about here, you are also yielding to a temptation. There's a sort of kind of interaction there, and particularly, the thing with sexuality, it's interesting that occult practices, as well as, ancient sort of pagan practices, often involve sexuality, because sexuality is this kind of inner sanctum of our sacred selves. It's a very spiritual sort of thing. And so it's often through our sexuality that these demonic forces try to gain entrance in some sense. And so, what you're saying then there is that it's not like, okay, it's first and foremost because this is grieving God, because you're objectifying something, because you're desecrating something. There's lots of problems with that. But you are also actually interacting with a demonic temptation. You know, in a sense, you're creating a point of access. Now, again, this is the beautiful thing about the good news of Jesus Christ, is that the moment you recognize that and repent and come, and it doesn't matter how many times or how much, or, you know, Jesus' sacrifice covers it completely, right? So there's always the opportunity, if we've stepped out from under the cover, to step back in, to repent, to recognize. And the moment we do that, actually, all the power of the enemy is gone, right? So as Paul says, there is now no condemnation, right?
Yeah.
And without condemnation, he has no power over us, right? But that's an example of where there's more going on, right? Because we are in the midst of a spiritual battle, right? It's the temptation to draw us in this direction, to come out from under the cover, that then makes us vulnerable in lots of ways that we just don't want to be made vulnerable.
Can just pick that up too. Sins involving sexuality is there's somewhere in the Bible, I can't think of where it is, where it actually talks about the greatness of that sin in some way, because it's actually against our own our own
in
body.
Corinthians,
It even goes beyond, you know, our body,
because your body is the temple
of the Holy Spirit. Because there's always like temptation, and there's always things that we do. There's a demonic existence out there that's always trying to lure us away out from the covering that God has given us. And it's like, well, it's always interacting with us in some way. It's therefore, like all sin, part of that interaction. But I was thinking that one of the things that kind of struck me is like things like sexuality, it affects us as people, and we're sacred beings. And when we distort or work in a way in sexuality that's different to how God planned it,
That devalues our sacredness.
we're attacking something that's sacred. Even if you don't consider yourself or other people sacred, you know, we're attacking something at a very spiritual level. The thing that God has made sacred is us. You know, people, we are sacred. So if we can desecrate that, even if we don't care, even if we're willing participants in it, we're still desecrating our sacredness and the sacredness of other people. And so it's not just what's happening in the physical world, it's what's happening in the spiritual world when we desecrate things that are sacred. So we're not just doing something bad, like a sin that has bad consequences. Things like sexuality actually is attacking sacredness itself.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the most powerful spiritual footholds you can get.
I mean, it's interesting to note that, you know, demonic spirits are referred to actually throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels, as unclean spirits. Another way of putting that is desecrating spirits. There's a sense in which they want to desecrate sacred space, because sacred space is essentially a space that they don't have access to, and that's the problem. So whatever is consecrated, although they, you know, there's and you know, referring back to our last episode, there's a sense in which they're able to influence anything. You know, Satan is described as the prince of this world, but there is these sacred space, and I'm not talking about physical spaces so much. Like, although I think there's
an element of that.
There is an element of that, but you know, our hearts are meant to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, right? So there's meant to be, this is a space that's consecrated. It's under the shadow of the Most High. And so there's this, you know, constant effort then of these unclean or desecrating spirits to want to desecrate these sacred spaces.
Can I just pick up the geographical thing? Because I think there is a whole, not geographical as in the way we think about this country or that country, but geographical as in
territorial.
Because if you look at the language around the Prince of Darkness and principalities, it's over dominions, it's authorities. And even if you look at the Garden of Eden, that was an area that was set aside to be, and then in the end they're cast out. There's a lot about, as you said before, you know, our sacred space being us as human beings, but also other spaces where evil spirits or unclean spirits want to inhabit, because it is about dominion, it is about authority over space.
Yeah, that's right. And there has been it has been quite common, and I think is, for Christians to consecrate spaces.
Totally.
You know, spaces in time, spaces in geographical space to consecrate those spaces. Now,
can I come back to that though, just before you move on?
Complexities with that,
and you can speak to that. If you look at what they say about idols, we tend to think of an idol as something that I just kind of, that thing's my God, and I destroy it, and now my God's gone. In the old days, they ascribed, in a sense, they prayed in through ritual, let's just say, evil spirits to inhabit their idols. Yeah. So it gave them that space.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what gave those idols the power, because they invited those unclean spirits into those idols. Now, when that idol got destroyed, let's say, it's not that their God was destroyed. They just had to create another thing for their spirit to inhabit.
So they gave permission. It's
correct.
That's right. And we talked about that in the last episode. So the other, I just want to quickly address another thing that we've got to be cautious about, and that is we need to be cautious about over-ascribing things to Satan as well. So we absolutely need to be vigilant. This is a reality. It's going on all the time. We need to remember we're in the midst of a spiritual battle, as Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 6. But we also need to be careful of over-ascribing. Now, Satan would love us to believe that he's in control of everything, ultimate control of everything that happens. He's just pulling the strings everywhere, right? That actually, it's interesting because Genesis 1 is actually written to counter the view that the gods, and again, referring to the last episode, the gods are associated actually with demonic beings behind, those gods. Ancient people thought that everything was gods: the sun, the moon, the wind, the storm, the sea, everything. Whereas what Genesis actually does is to limit that and to say, no, that you're over-ascribing things to these other beings, that everything, creation are things that God has created. They're not gods. They weren't created or brought into existence by gods. So it limits the realm of these spirits, in a sense, puts them in their place. And so while this is a reality, we need to be careful about ascribing everything that happens to, demonic, spirits. It's like, and also one of the problems with that is it also can be a way in which we abdicate responsibility as well. It's the devil made me do it. It's
or she did it.
It's it's
as in
Eden. Yeah, that's right. It's like blaming the snake, in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. I remember a couple saying to me once that, they'd had a lot of conflict, and they said, "Oh, we're really under attack, demonic attack." And as they described it to me, it sounds more like you're attacking one another. So we've got to be careful that we don't abdicate our responsibility, because we were, yes, we can be tempted, but our actions are our actions. So we just need to be careful of that as well.
I've had conversations with people before who are trying to work through their faith, and that's often is something that I've heard people say a lot, is it's the devil stopping me doing this, the devil, and it's like an ongoing thing of the devil's doing this, the devil's doing that. Yeah. And one of the things I've said to these people is stop talking about the devil. Like you're just giving him way too much.
That's over-ascribing, Just
stop talking about him. It preoccupies their thoughts all the time. It's almost like they're wanting to live better and overcome sin. They keep seeing this fight against the devil all the time that's stopping them from becoming the person that they want to be, but they just can't quite get there for whatever reasons. And so they focus on the devil. And it's kind of like the devil's this, the devil's that you're just giving the devil way too much attention here. Just stop talking about the devil. Like, just move on.
And he would love us to believe that he's doing everything and pulling every string and getting in, as we clarified in the last episode, God is sovereign over our lives. And even the demonic world, they are allowed to do things to bring certain things to the surface, right? This is why God allows us to live in the mess that we created. Exactly in the same way that, if in the book of Judges, God allowed his people to be oppressed by the surrounding nations that they chose to interact with. And God said, don't get involved with these because they will oppress you. And then they did, and then they were oppressed. And God allowed that actually for some time until they actually cried out to him. But when they cried out to him, he saved them. Now, that salvation would not have happened if they would not have felt the pain of that oppression. And so, in a sense, God allows this to happen because he wants us to make decisions and to call out to him. And so God is completely sovereign over this. And so I think we need to be careful, yes, about over-ascribing things. This is, it's been described as the satanic panic. Of course, Satan would love us to just panic and think that he's doing and again, no, God is sovereign over all of this, and we need to focus, and I think the illustration that I used last time is we need to focus on walking down the road that God has called us to walk down. On either side of that road are fences and dogs barking behind those fences. It's like the demonic world, right? They want to either lure us to putting our hand in the fence or even walking into the yard, right, where they're going to maul us. Or even just distract us from looking ahead, and walking down the road to slow us down, like, bark, when you're walking along a footpath and a dog barks and you get a fright. Well, no, it's behind a fence, right?
But the more dangerous dogs are the dogs that come up to the fence and whimper and give you that, and that's how demons or evil spirits
try and lure you to put your hand in. That's right.
Exactly.
So just we need to keep walking down this road.
The slowing down is an interesting part of that analogy too, because I think that comes back to what I just said. Because you can actually go, okay, I'm going to walk, and my eyes are on God, but I'm just very cautious, and the dogs keep barking at me, and I kind of stop and slow down a bit, and then it's like,
or in fright you run into another yard, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because of what's barking at you in one yard, you run into another.
You mightn't
yard.
be putting a
Fear
hand
does that.
in the fence, but it's still having an influence over you.
Yeah,
and this is what I see people doing, like by saying the devil keeps doing this or makes me do that. You're almost giving some sort of level of permission or authority of Satan in your life, even just by obsessing about what you think he's doing. Right. It's almost like giving up part of that authority.
Well, their goal is to take glory from God. Yeah. So the minute you give them, ascribe them, that's exactly they've achieved their goal.
You think you're not. You think you're kind of like super aware of what Satan's doing in my life, and therefore I'm focused on that and trying to drive him out. But in effect, I'm just giving him way too much attention, and it's actually slowing me down. It's causing me to look at the dogs. I think in the analogy, and don't want to take it too far, but I kind of see that we just got to walk ahead. Just forget the dogs on the either side. Walk ahead. Don't slow down. They can't hurt you. Just keep moving.
Yeah.
But instead, we kind of like look at them and slow down, and kind of, we might be putting our hands in the fence, but we're still allowing them to influence us, even though they're on the other side of the fence.
Well, you don't overcome the evil one by focusing on the evil one. You trample upon the serpent by remaining, I mean moving with God, as walking with God forwards. And so it's Peter stepping out of the boat and focusing on Jesus. It was only when he was freaked and looked at the wind and the waves, and I mean the symbolism there is that sort of ancient symbolism of chaos and death and the forces of chaos, which is associated actually with the demonic world. By focusing on that, he started to sink. It's that focus on Jesus and on walking with God that's important. I think let's talk about the spectrum of influence, because one of the questions that I often get asked about this is, this is the way that the question is put. And often the way that the question is put is not helpful in the first place.
So a lot of
people say, can Christians be demon possessed? Okay. Because they read in their Bibles about such and such a person who was demon possessed. Now, the word possessed actually isn't there in the Greek. It's a word, and actually the word demon comes from a Greek word. So the Greek word actually is demonized. Okay, so someone is demonized. So it's someone who's influenced by a demon or many demons, as in Mark chapter 5, I think it is.
But
in some cases, it does certainly look like possession. But these categories, we talk about possession as, yes, one perhaps end of a trajectory, but there are lots of ways in which we can be, let's say, influenced by these demonic forces, a whole spectrum.
But isn't there something to do with possession where there's like a spirit actually takes over like you've actually lost control of your body? So maybe the Bible talks about it like in the sense of where Jesus drove the demonic spirits into the pigs, and the pigs just
Yeah, and
took
that is
off.
position. That's what we're saying.
They've
But that's at one end.
They've taken
Yeah,
over that the bot.
Yeah.
They're actually
Yeah.
actively controlling those.
Yeah.
That's
And
what we're
also-
talking about when we mean possession.
Yeah, and that man who he
Yeah.
cast them out from. But what we kind of, I think what Matt's
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
say is there's two ends of the spectrum. That's the one end of the
Yeah.
spectrum.
Yes.
But we shouldn't just say if I'm not possessed, I'm all good, because then there's a whole lot of influence that works its way back. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we could speak in one step in from that is we could talk about demon oppression, okay, and where someone is oppressed but not possessed. Now, this is language that has been used a bit, and we've just got to be careful because these are categories that we create to describe things. But there is a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of influence, and probably at one end is just the ordinary temptation, is that experience of being lured, where we're lured into a behavior or into doing something. At an ordinary level, it's when we get poked and prodded and engage in whether it's, pornography or to resent a person, for example, drawn into anger. I mean, anger is a very problematic one as well. I mean, Satan wants us to just be angry. This is quite a common one. So it's like, get angry. And,
well, if we talk about temptation, though, we're even talking about before you get angry. Like, it's tempting to get angry. You don't
that's right.
necessarily need to get.
So the temptations are not just designed to get us to do something; they are designed to cause a change of attitude. Actually, that can then become a means by which Satan can have some even greater influence. Right. So, if it's, say, sexual sin, often that leads to shame, right? And the problem with shame is that it has us sort of wallowing in this dark sort of place where we believe that we're useless, we're hopeless, where a lot of lies can take hold of us. Lies that we're of no value, we're a hopeless case, when actually the opposite is true. We're sacred, even when there's been a sense of desecration or violation of that sacredness, whether it's because of something that someone has done to us or because something that we've done, we're still sacred and valuable to God. I mean, Jesus died to save us from that, right? But the thing is, we come to believe that we are of no value, and that then becomes,
Or we're beyond reach.
yeah, and then that creates a vulnerability, right? Because we then try to create a sense of our own value. I need to create a sense of my own value to be valuable to people. And so we sort of objectify ourselves, and that leads to all sorts of problems, right? Another example is the temptation to, and temptations are always lies. They're deceptions as well, right? There's a sense of,
But often based on truth.
yeah, which is
what makes
Genesis
them
chapter
deception.
3, right? Hey, look at this. This looks good. It seemed good. It looked good to them, right? But also they were tricked into thinking that this is going to make you happy in some sense, right? God's withholding something. Step over this line and man, you're going to experience something good when you step over this line. So there's always deception involved. And
Is there even deception, or do you know that this isn't good for you, but you're going to do it anyway?
well, it's often deception because I'm thinking of cases where you say something to me and I get really offended at what you've said and I harbor bitterness or anger at that. Now, often that response can be actually because of insecurities see, all of these things, there's often already weaknesses or vulnerabilities that we have. Often, can I say, even inherited vulnerabilities that we have, where we feel, a lack of value, or we feel, or there are areas of, generally speaking, areas of vulnerability. And often, they are almost like infections, like emotional infections. And so when someone then says something that someone without that infection might just say, oh, no, look, that's not, would just brush it off, right? But a person with a vulnerability is like a person with an infected wound, that the slightest word to press on that, and it hurts, right? And the reaction is one of anger and offense. That's essentially what offense is. It's a kind of pain because of someone has touched on a vulnerability, in your life. And then, that creates an opening for certain lies about that person, right? Because then you could believe something about me that's absolutely not true of my attitude or towards you or, you believe, you just end up believing all of these lies. And then often that leads to anger, right? And bitterness. Now the thing with bitterness is then that can become a real, as you hold on to that, that then what's starting to form there is a kind of a stronghold, right? You harboring that bitterness. It's this pain. You're easily angered by lots of different, situations. And so that's where an initial foothold, which is a lie, ends up becoming a stronghold. And so I would, if you are a person that you find you are constantly angry, that lots of situations make you angry, from responses to people, but also even things that are going on maybe in our country or in our, it's this constant anger at, now that actually can be a bit of a stronghold because it's not, this is the interesting thing too, because people like that often try to justify, it's a righteous anger.
Yes.
But there's nothing righteous about that, about that anger. And I just think we've got to be very careful because, again, remember, Satan wants to lie to you and make you think that you're justified. And
I have a
self-justification is the ultimate way of covering over and hiding,
totally,
of hiding these things.
I think there is a righteous anger, and it can be right to be angry at things. But maybe what you're talking about there,
we've got to be very careful with that.
But we've got to be careful.
I think there's a difference between being angry at things and being angry at people. So we could be angry about the way things are happening in the world, but we shouldn't make that anger a personal anger against the person.
It's when it becomes this. It's not just being angry about something. I think there's almost like two dimensions to anger. There's one that you can be angry at the way that things are, but it's not something you internalize. Like it doesn't become this internal drive or sense of mission where it's boiling away, and which is where I see so many people at. And even in terms of politics, it's like they're just so the anger of going, look, this is wrong, and I'm kind of angry at one level, the surface level. But it's when it becomes really deep within you that it actually replaces the mission that you have, that God does want you to.
It takes over.
Serve in,
so this is the importance. This is the importance of dealing with you, because we all get angry, right? And the worst way to deal with your anger is to repress it. Okay, what you do is you take it. You do what they do in the Psalms. They get angry. Psalm 4, it says, be angry, but do not sin.
Yeah.
Okay. So anger is the response of anger. It's all about what we do with that and what can happen if we don't take it to God. As Paul says, don't repay evil with evil, repay evil with good, because vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And what you see them doing with their anger in the Psalms, we're getting onto another topic here, but is they take their anger to God, and there's a sense of relinquishing that. They express it all, they pour it all out before God, right? But then He's the judge. Now, one of the things that can happen when we're angry is that we're drawn. This is what Satan wants to do, right? He wants to draw us out from under God. He wants to tempt us to play God.
Yes.
Right? This is, then you will be like God. This was the temptation in Genesis 3. So this is why anger is such a powerful stronghold, because it appeals to this God complex within us, which is really the original sin, is pride, being like God. Because pride is so deeply embedded in the inherited human psyche, right? That God complex. This is why I'm saying we need to be very, very careful about our anger and what we're doing with our anger, because it can become this constant judgment when you are sitting in a judgment seat, you're in the devil's territory there. You've got to be really careful of that. You think you're in control, but no, when you're in the judgment seat, it's a complete deception. You are in the most dangerous place of all.
Maybe a telltale sign that the difference of where anger becomes problematic is when it feels good. It feels good to be angry at something or angry at a person. If someone does something and they offend you, it feels good to be angry at them, doesn't it? Like, am I the only one? But it actually feels like
we're gonna have a bit of prayer ministry.
Maybe it's just me.
No, I know. No, that's right. No,
it does feel good.
Yeah, it feels
to think
satisfying. Yeah,
to feel that I just have to not absorb that offense. and deflect it.
But it's also becomes a tormenting thing. It's the thing that keeps you awake through the night. I mean, it's, when you hold on to your anger, it's like swallowing a poison and thinking it's going to harm the other person. It actually becomes torment. And this is the being angry. It starts with being angry at someone and then other people, and then you're angry at the world and you're angry at the government and you're angry at everything. I mean, look at the New Testament writers, man. I mean, they could have been angry at the world because, man, they lived in a terrible, terrible circumstance. The early Christians were terribly, terribly persecuted, right? But there's so much teaching around forgiveness and turn the other cheek, because because the thing with the persecution, it's the devil trying to make them angry, right? Make them angry, because if we can make them angry and get them to judge these, I mean, this is why we've got to be careful at this approach to sort of cultural critique where, they shut down RE and then they shut down this and then they've got the Change or Suppression Act and then they've got, and we're just angry and angry and angry at the government. It's exactly what the devil wants.
That becomes your mission. In a sense, now you've got a mission, and it's almost like, sign me up.
Exactly.
It's like,
it's the wrong mission.
It's like, but it actually energizes you.
Yeah.
It actually suddenly, you've got a mission to live for God. And so, but I think sometimes those sins, they always feel good. And being angry, we can be so riled up about something. We can hardly sleep at night because we're so angry about it. I know in myself that I think I have to forgive that person. I have to let go of my anger and not act out maybe what I want to do, which is to attack them or undermine them or, do things to get back at them. That feels good to me to do that, to let it go and actually then not just let it go, but actively maybe even lift that person up. If someone comes and hurts you, it's not just about quietly forgiving them, but what can I actually do to elevate that person, to actually pour goodness into their life, which is really the reframing of the narrative that Jesus was preaching on the Sermon of the Mount and so on, is reframing that whole narrative. But that doesn't feel good.
Yeah, because you're angry.
What do you mean, though, that it doesn't feel good?
It doesn't feel...
But it does release you, though. Ultimately, it does release you.
But this is the paradox. Doing the tempting stuff is there to, on the surface level maybe, it doesn't feel good to do that. It takes a huge amount of going, it feels easy and it feels good to get angry and to work against that system. It feels hard to actually pour goodness into that situation. Now, it's that feeling of that inner turmoil, which I'm kind of getting at, which is maybe that's an indicator for me because, I'll get angry at people and situations and so on, and I will react that way. And I know within my own mind, I'm kind of counseling myself saying, you shouldn't be reacting that way to that person. And I'm fighting within myself going, I don't want to,
how are they going to learn if I don't?
Yeah, it's going to be easy. And so there's a resistance and a battle going on all the time.
Angry, and let me put it this way, and angry Christians love to refer to the thing, that episode where Jesus took up the whip and turned over the tables.
Yeah.
And, they love that one. Now, we just need to be really careful with that because that gets applied to, that's an example of righteous. Now, I mean, the thing is, he is doing that in his role as the prophet and son of God and the judge.
Take it back to who has no sin, let him cast the first stone. There was no one else who could throw a stone. Yeah. There was no one else who could really none of us can turn the tables.
Yeah. So we need to, and also we've got to remember, he wasn't doing that to the Gentiles and the sinners. It was those who thought they were righteous, right? That's who he was angry
always,
with. Yeah.
I think all examples of that where Jesus actually actively plays out active anger is always against those that are supposedly representing him.
And I think this is one of the...
And they were desecrating the temple.
Yeah, that's right.
As well. Pretty serious stuff.
So this is the thing. One of the sort of symptoms of, a stronghold is this vehement protectiveness of that stronghold. And so this, I mean, we're just using anger here as an example. Okay.
Yeah.
So what you see with someone who's very angry is that they will vehemently self-justify. They will jump to justification. Oh no, but this, and it's all, and it's justification upon justification upon justification. And yet there's a problem. Jesus had every right to be angry when he hung on the cross. I mean, he was being tortured, unjustly tortured. And yet he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Right. That is the ultimate example, right? He is destroying the works of the evil one in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to read it as a story of Jesus hanging on the cross, dying for our sins, the ultimate sacrifice for us. But when you read it in context of the whole of what was he teaching the disciples, what was he preaching, Sermon on the Mount, what was he doing when he was standing before being judged, before being sentenced to death, what was he teaching when he was hanging on a cross? After undergoing the worst of oppression from evil that, a human being can go through, his response was still not get angry at that. He's teaching us something. That's maybe is one of the big lessons that's in all of that. This is how you overcome evil.
Matt, so just coming back to your footholds and strongholds, and then we can move on to the next thing. The only thing I want to say is I feel like there's a step before wanting to be like God, and that is not trusting God at his word.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think a lot of these things, this person's harmed me, but I've got to trust God's going to deal with this in a fair way or whatever it might be. And I think if we look at the way we create idols for ourselves in the Western world in particular, it's not trusting God for our provision. It's not trusting God. That's where a lot of this stuff begins is, am I going to just trust God for this, or am I not going to trust God for this?
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I think, we've talked about that's kind of influence, or that, the ways in which we get manipulated and we give the devil a foothold. I think it's Paul that talks about, do not give the devil a foothold. He's talking about, it talks about the root of bitterness as well. Just be careful. It's a foothold. Yeah. Foothold becomes a stronghold. Is it ongoing? Because it compounds, right? It becomes a point of access. And if there's no repentance there, it then becomes a stronghold. So a stronghold, essentially, this is our language. I mean, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul talks about demolishing strongholds. And basically what he's talking about there is deceptive systems, ways of thinking. And he's not just talking about intellectual systems. He's talking about belief systems that we hold on to. So something becomes a stronghold when it is actually a lie that completely reshapes the way then we view everything, right? We view everything through that lie. It has a stronghold on us, and it becomes the lens through which we see. It could be, deep forms of shame actually can become strongholds, right? Because it almost sort of dictates how we do and how we respond in different situations. So they become these sort of lies, and it's often a mixture of, like we've been hurt, and that, caused us to react, in a certain way. And it might be a legitimate hurt, might be something, that's, yes, maybe someone did do something wrong, but because we reacted in this certain way, it sort of goaded us in the wrong direction. I mean, there's a cruelty to this, because things can happen to us that are genuinely wrong, but we are goaded into responding with anger and bitterness, and then a stronghold forms, right? And then this is a situation where it then starts to determine how we respond to every situation, right? And that's when it becomes a stronghold. Now, to demolish that stronghold, you have to bring the lie, the deep lie, and even why you believe that lie into the light, and that is what, that's what, in a sense, can begin to, undermine those strongholds. Now, because they become very deeply habitual, because it's not just an intellectual thing. I mean, the example is, child gets bitten by a dog for the rest of their life. They have this reaction of fear to dogs because the trauma involved in that. That's a very ordinary sort of, example of where where something becomes a habitual sort of reaction. You can do a PhD in canine behavior or something and know that a certain breed of dog will never harm you, and yet at the same time you're going to have this slightly irrational kind of reaction. So open wounds can become chinks in our armor. Open wounds can, emotional wounds can become
opportunities,
points of access. It's like if I have an open wound, these microscopic germs, even that are in the air, can get into that wound and cause the wound to get infected. And so what we do in that case is that we sanitize the wound, but then we close the wound. And deliverance ministry is a lot about both of those elements. To use that, it's not just about sanitizing the wound, right? But it's also about closing the wound. The wound needs to heal. There needs to be healing. Whatever has caused that weakness or that opening, that emotional wound, that can actually lead to lies getting in, about that. So if I've been mistreated in some way, that can become an open wound that can open me up to the lie that you are worth nothing, that you are an object, that you are despicable, that you are an object to be used and abused. And that's how the wound gets it, because those lies get into that open wound. And so deliverance ministry is not just about telling the devil to nick off or the demonic spirits to nick off. I mean, if you do that, as Jesus says, you can cleanse the house, but then the demon goes and gets 7 others and comes in, and the first state of the person is worse than the last state. That's why there's got to be healing, and the lies have to be addressed as well. Essentially, what you're doing then is addressing the lies and the things that you believed about yourself and about God. This is actually, I know all of this sounds complicated, but it's actually a form of very deep repentance. Repentance is a powerful, powerful thing, right? We are granted this opportunity to recognize, bring those things into the light. That's what confession is, right? Deep confession is saying, okay, yes, this happened to me, but I've actually believed this lie back then, right? And because I believed that lie, I've then responded. I responded in that situation, right? I've held on to unforgiveness or malice, and then that's led to me doing the same thing in every other situation, right? And there's a wonderful opportunity here to do this deep confession where we acknowledge that, we bring it into the light. As soon as something is in the light, it's lost its power over you, right? Strongholds can only be maintained in the darkness, right? This is why when you go to address those things, there's going to be there'll be a lot of things wanting you not to do that, right? So this is where you are not going to want to go to that counseling appointment. You know what I mean? You're just going to like, oh no, it's too much, it's too hard. And all of these lies are going to come in. No, it's too much, it's too hard. You can't deal with it. It's like, and it'll also overcomplicate the situation, because actually there's a very liberating form of deep confession that says, you know what? Yeah, I believed a lie. I've judged, I've held on to unforgiveness. On the wrong side of that, you think there's no way I'm ever going to forgive that person. But as soon as you bring the lie into the light and you realize that other person, they're just another fallen human being. They're just another victim. You know what I mean? They're a victim also, right? And it's not, again, justifying that behavior. It's certainly seeing that, something went wrong. But, there's a power in bringing that into the light and bringing your response and bringing the lies into the light. It starts to lose its power over you, and it begins a healing process that then closes and heals the wound and deals with that point of influence. We're still up the end of influence and oppression, and there's probably another episode in this, I think, to talk about this a little bit more.
But it's almost like there's a silent or an invisible oppression. It's not apparent to you. It's not like an overt evil force acting upon you.
It's parasitic. That's right. So it wants to hide itself.
It's just hiding. And so there's a resistance to deal with it, which will oppress you from dealing with it. But as long as you don't deal with it, it's completely invisible to you. It manifests in other ways in how you react and interact in situations and so on. But other than that, it's kind of almost feels benevolent.
So let me maybe we'll finish with an example. Let me tell a story actually that was really powerful for me. So when I was in high school, in boarding school, there was a particular instance where someone, a really popular guy, actually in front of other people, just really humiliated me, just abused me in ways and put me down, and it was extremely hurtful. Right? At the time, all my coping mechanisms kicked into, and I actually just forgot about that. But I harbored this anger, actually, this sensitivity to people would say the least things, and it would be like pressing on an infection, right? And I was actually in a counselling session, and I was praying with my counsellor, and I had forgotten about this, but the counsellor did a very simple thing and just asked, is there anything around this that you feel like is coming to the surface? And the thing that immediately went back to this memory, right? And I mentioned this memory, and it was absolutely still an open wound. It was an open wound. I just sort of repressed that, and the counsellor asked a very important question. Okay, she said, where is Jesus in that, right? And I had this immediate picture of Jesus face to face with me, like nose to nose, with his hands over my ears, like he was there. And the interesting thing is, I now can't recall that without seeing Jesus in the midst of it. Mm-hmm. And it brought such a healing to that wound, that moment, the lie, because it was the value and the affirmation of Christ in that moment that replaced that lie. And so that was an example of an open wound. It was so simply dealt with,
But you didn't
because
know.
I believed the lie. Like I believed what was said to me. Like there was a curse that was spoken over my life. Now, I believed it. So that's my response. I know this sounds funny, but that's my response when we believe lies. And then that led to me actually reacting in really dysfunctional ways in certain situations. So,
were you aware of its impact on your life prior to that counselling session? Probably
no.
not. You remember it as a fact.
I remember it as a fact,
because
but I didn't realise it. I just that's in the past.
Because I know in myself, I kind of think, if you were to ask me, is there any of those kind of deep, kind of traumatic things I think I'm going through life carrying this deep wound that's impacting me spiritually and giving that kind of stronghold in my life, and I would say I can't think of anything. And I think there'd be a lot of people would be like that, and maybe that's part of the deception, is the making these things invisible. They're in there, but as long as they stay under the surface, invisible.
Well, they do, but they come out in strange ways.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, I would have dreams where I would be like violent, like angry and violently getting back at people in that school context. I remember having a dream about that person that did that, where I was trying to pick up implements and hit, and I just kept going through him, and I was so angry and frustrated. I remember actually waking up crying, like in frustration, right? This is when, Kate said, you need to go and deal with that, right? As this is, a discerning wife can help. But this is the thing, there is a simplicity to the solution. I mean, the complexity is on our side. The simplicity there was inviting Jesus into that space. Mm-hmm. It was going back and bringing that out to God. It's the thing of asking God, why do I act and react in that way? I mean, and now actually I've gotten into the habit of asking that question, what does this go back? Am I holding on to something here? God will answer those prayers. Sometimes praying with someone else can help that, particularly someone else who's trained in this area to help you bring these things to the surface if there's some things really lodged there. But essentially this is a form of deep confession and repentance that leads to liberation. It allows Jesus to bring healing, truth, and liberation into that circumstance.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivettoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivettoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.